Hello people of the internet, I'm Nico and today I'm bringing you the first episode of The Checklist. Today I'm featuring this 2001 VW Jetta Wagon, which you probably have seen in several comedy skits that I've made in the past. Now, if you haven't seen the announcement video for this, I'm starting a new show exclusively on my YouTube channel where I'll be featuring random cars and going over the features that it does have and that it doesn't have, which will then be followed by a driving portion where I give my general opinion on the vehicle. This show was created with the intention of helping people make the right next car purchase. Now, onto an overview. The VW Jetta has been around since the 1980s and is currently in its 7th generation. From 1999 to 2005, there was this, the 4th generation Jetta, which was produced with the sedan and wagon variant, this one clearly being the Wagon. With different body styles came a variety of engine choices, ranging from a 4-cylinder diesel to VW's famous VR6 engine, though this particular one has the 4-cylinder 2-liter engine with 115 horsepower and 122 pound-feet of torque. With the low power figure came almost good fuel economy, rated at 21 mpg in the city and 29 on the highway according to the EPA. And now, on to the checklist. Now, before I get started with the interior, I actually want to touch base on the safety features, which, since it's a 2001 car, it's not going to be the most up-to-date vehicle in terms of safety tech, but there are some things that this car did come as standard with according to Edmunds.com, and that includes 2 front headrests, 3 rear headrests, child seat anchors for the back seat, daytime running lights, as well as this one has fog lights, dual front side mounted airbags, electric brake force distribution, engine immobilizer, front and rear head airbags, front seatbelt pretensioners, remote anti-theft alarm system, 4-wheel ABS, which is anti-lock braking system, rear center lap belt, rear door child safety locks. That does mean that this car is missing out on some rather crucial driving aids, including traction control, stability control, and radar cruise control. Now, radar cruise control was a thing in the 2000s, but it was not something that you saw in regular everyday cars, so that is understandable. But traction control and stability control were making their way into regular cars, and this car, while it was available with VW's version, which was called ASR, I believe, it did not come as standard, and this particular car was not equipped with that. Other things you miss out on are parking sensors and a rear view camera, which 2000s again didn't really exist for regular cars. As for the interior, it is definitely very 2000s in here. There's a lot of cheap black plastic, and as expected, there are basically no screens aside from a small display here in the radio, which can show you what radio station you're listening to. Now, aside from that, there is, rather impressively, an 8-speaker sound system, but it doesn't really get any better after that. There's a cassette player, which actually still works, if I'm not mistaken, a CD player, and there is an optional CD changer, but this car doesn't have it. You also get cruise control, which is controlled by this stalk over here. There's a little tab that you push to the left to increase the speed, and a button on the end of it to decrease the speed. And if you want to disengage it, you pull the tab to the right. You also get cup holders, which are very complexly engineered and hidden inside the actual center console. There's a little design here that shows a cup. You press on it, and they just come right out. And then you can push them back in. You also get some regular lighting, interior air filtration, dual vanity mirrors, and single zone air conditioning, which is a rather nice feature, but it doesn't cool down that well, as the air vents are frankly tiny and can be stopped by just 3 fingers, even ones this size. As for the power features, there are a few. You do have power windows for the front and rear seats. The front ones are one touch, at least on the way down. You get remote keyless power door locks, heated mirrors, power mirrors, and this one in particular was also optioned with the heated seats, which go up to 5 stages, interestingly, rather than your usual 2 or 3. And it also has a power sunroof, which is operated with this knob right here, which can go to any position you want. So you can go from completely closed to, say, halfway open to fully open, whatever your heart desires, frankly. In the backseat of the Jetta now, and admittedly, I'm not going to spend too much time here because 1, there's not much to go over, and 2, it is rather cramped back here. As you can see, my knees are right up against the front seat. Actually, I have to go on either side just to fit for real, though I can kind of squeeze them in, though it's definitely not comfortable, and I'm kind of pushing up against the passenger. Now, aside from the rather lackluster rear legroom, My feet actually have somewhat amount of room to move about. It's not cramped for my feet necessarily, it's more that my knees are right up against the seat. There's no center armrest that comes out of the middle of the bench, and there's no air vents or cup holders back here. You get a handle, you have a power windows button, which I wouldn't touch because the power windows don't really work back here, or at least the windows get stuck. You've got a little speaker up here, and you have another larger speaker down in the bottom of the door, and you have the oh shit handle, and that's about it, quite frankly. You also do get, one last thing, some storage in both of the front seats actually, but that really is it. Very little leg room and basically no amenities in the back seat of the Jetta. Now, the last thing I want to touch on is the trunk. Because this particular car is a station wagon, you do get a fairly roomy trunk, as you can see, long enough for a skateboard to fit in very easily in whichever direction you choose. You also get on the left side a panel that removes where you would find a hazard triangle, as well as actually where the CD changer would be, but isn't because this car doesn't have one. And on the right side, you get a first aid kit, which is, well, you used to get a first aid kit. Now it's gone, and instead replaced by a toilet paper roll and a tool. Yeah, that's about it. Behind the wheel of the Jetta now, and I'll be the first to admit that this is not the cleanest example there is. It's got a lot of panels that are very loose. It's got a piece of wood that is keeping the glove box closed. This panel that allows you to get to the motor that controls the sunroof is held on by one clip and is very nearly falling out. The door panel here that has the door handle on it and the window switches, that is completely loose, and I have pulled it out on accident every time I've closed it. Well, not every time I close the door, but oftentimes when I close the door. And then there's various squeaks and rattles from the suspension, and then generally, because it's an older car, it's not nearly as well sound deadened as newer cars are. So you naturally hear more of the engine, as well as more of the road, more wind noise, yada yada yada, the list goes on. Now, with that being said, for a 2001 car, it's not too bad in here. The plastic on the dashboard is actually kind of a squidgy, kind of softer plastic, interestingly, which is actually kind of nice to touch. Everything still works. The heated seats, both driver and passenger side, still work. Sunroof still works. The lights still work, fog lights included. The air conditioning still works. The heat still works. The radio, the cassette player. I think the cassette player still works. I haven't tried it out, but it's frankly fantastic. The rear windows, while the motor still works, the windows actually kind of tilt and get stuck in the window frame, so I don't really touch those, but the front windows work completely fine. So I don't really have many issues with this car. I have had to do some maintenance on this just because it's an older car, so I've had to do the steering rack. That was the largest job I think I've done on this, and the largest job I've ever done on any car, frankly. And this car did have a coolant issue where one of the plastic pieces on the side of the engine block had developed a crack. So if you're looking at one of these, be careful to check the steering rack and the coolant. Well, specifically the piece on the right side of the engine block where there's a bunch of hoses going into it. There should be 4 hoses and they kind of go together in a cross. Be sure to check that that has not developed a crack in it. Aside from that, all of the hoses are still the original 20-year-old hoses that went on the factory. Yeah, it's a fairly robust car, to be honest. Now, that's not to say that the engine is the best in the world. At a 2-liter capacity, you would expect a bit more power out of it. And newer engines, obviously, even with at this size, they would be even more economical. But that is not the case with this 20-year-old kind of crap box, I should say. But generally, I don't really have an issue with it. There were times where first gear failed, like he couldn't get it into first gear, so he'd have to start in second, which, since this car has a very tight gear ratio, is not the end of the world. You can start in second gear perfectly fine, but obviously it is nice to have first gear to go into. But yeah, those things aside, it's a fairly nice vehicle. It's never stranded me, interestingly, aside from like a dead battery when I was at home. But aside from that, never once has it stranded me. And even when I had the coolant issue, I drove around with that for admittedly way too long. Literally had no coolant in the car and made it home perfectly fine. The engine temperature didn't even rise above 190. It stayed right in the middle where it was supposed to be. I don't know how, presumably because I was just driving most of the way, but even sitting in traffic, sitting still, no issues with it, which was surprising and honestly fairly impressive. But yeah, it's a fairly robust car, and if you find one that doesn't have any power steering issues or transmission, specifically in the manual, the gear shifting issues or the coolant issues, though the coolant issue is actually fairly easy to do. So even if there is a crack in the thing, I would still buy one. The coolant should not deter you, though the power steering is definitely something that should deter you. And the gear linkage issue can be a tough one to work out. So I'd definitely be wary of that, but otherwise, it's a fairly competent vehicle, especially if you're buying this as like your first car as a high schooler or a college student. Like, it will 99% of the time get you from place to place. Now, as for the values, I think these are typically going for around $2,000 to $3,000 nowadays. Obviously, there's some nicer examples with like the leather seats and the 6-cylinder VR6 engine that go for a bit more. But this one specifically is probably worth $1,000 or $2,000 at best. So it's a reasonably cheap, pretty reliable, somewhat fuel efficient daily driver. And obviously, being the Wagon, it's super practical. I was able, when I was driving this around in my first year of college, I was able to get a bicycle in the back seat, not removing the front wheel, perfectly fine. It wasn't like a massive bicycle, it was just your average size bicycle, but I still got a full-size bicycle into the back, admittedly with the rear seats folded down, but you know, with a small car, it's kind of expected to fold down the rear seats, and even in your average SUV, you'd probably have to fold down the rear seats to get a bicycle in without taking out the front wheel. So all in all, it's honestly a decent car. Obviously, there are competitors like the Honda Civic, the Toyota Corolla, that are also fairly competent, but none of those were offered as a wagon, which is frankly disappointing, and kind of a nice selling point for this, because it is therefore much more practical than those cars. And the fuel economy, I don't know the specific figures for the Corolla or the Civic, or any other competitors, frankly, but I would imagine that they did a little bit better in terms of fuel economy, and possibly even had a bit more power. VW has always kind of been lacking in terms of performance when it comes to the Jetta. Though more recently they have been catching up a bit, and then they've been very good in terms of fuel economy. So the newer ones are also very good cars, but more on that in a different video. As for this one, yeah, if you have, say, a budget of $3,000 and you're looking for a first car, then this is definitely a contender.